Hey folks, in this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with CSS Grid to lay out elements on your website. So how does Grid work? Well, with CSS Grid, you start with a parent element that contains child elements. Then you turn the parent into a grid container by adding display grid to its styles. Next, you can create your grid template, which is an arrangement of rows and columns in whatever number and size you want. The child elements can then get placed in the grid template automatically, or you can explicitly place them anywhere you want in the grid, either using grid line numbers for the rows and columns, or using named grid areas that get assigned to specific cells of the overall grid template. Now, I know this may sound all rather complicated, but don't worry because I'm going to show you how to do all of this and more step by step in this video. Alright, so I'm starting with VS Code on the left, and then I have the local website running on the right. And I currently have some basic styles for background color and then also global padding. Now to start with Grid, similar to Flexbox, you need to have a parent element that will be the grid container. And then in that you have one or more child elements that will be the grid child items. So in our HTML, I'm going to create a parent div with a class of grid parent. And then in that, I'm going to create a child div with a class of grid child. And then inside that, I'll write grid child 1. Now let's duplicate this a few times. And there we go. And then let's add some styles. So for the grid parent, I'm going to set background color to light gray. And then for the grid child, I'll add background color of turquoise. And there we go. So now let's create our grid. So on the grid parent, I'm going to write display grid. And doing this transforms the grid parent into a grid container, and then it also unlocks all of the grid properties that we can add either on the parent or the child. Now, even though it looks like nothing on the website has changed, it is a grid container, and the grid child items are now behaving according to the grid layout mode instead of the normal flow. So let's add some space between the grid children with gap of 10 pixels. Now we got some space between each of the grid child items. Now, one thing you might notice that Grid does different from Flexbox is that by default, it's going to put each of the grid children in their own row, as opposed to in Flexbox, you have all the grid children, all the Flexbox children, you try to fit them on the same row. All right, so let's check out some of these default grid styles that we have going on here. So I'm going to right click, inspect, and let's go to the grid parent here. And if we go to the computed tab and check the browser styles checkbox, then we can filter for the grid styles and see what some of those defaults are. And I'm going to actually add auto. So we have some grid auto properties here. Grid auto flow means that the grid container is automatically going to make the grid child items flow in rows, which we can see here. Each one is in their own row. And this is similar to the flex direction in Flexbox. Then aside from that, we have grid auto columns and grid auto rows. That the auto value means that the grid children are going to be sized according to the content that they have. So right now they're all the same height because each of the grid child items just has one line of text, but let's make one of them bigger. So I'm going to go back to our HTML, and then for grid child 2, I'm going to add some lorem ipsum placeholder text. Let's say maybe 20. So now when we save, you can see that the second row with grid child 2 is bigger, and this is not affecting the other rows. Each row is sized according to their content. Now let's also change the flow direction. So in our styles for the grid parent, we'll add grid auto flow, and let's set it to column instead of row. So now when we save, each of the grid child items is going to be put into a column, and they're all going to be in the same row. Now by default, the columns are going to be sized with the grid auto columns property, which is going to default to auto. So with columns, the size of each grid child item is their width. And you can see that grid child 2 is larger, the width is bigger than the others because it has more content. So it's basically forcing the other columns to just be their minimum size in order to fit the text content, and then it's going to take up any available space. So one side note, with grid you can have rows and columns, and they also might be called tracks if you've seen it mentioned elsewhere. So tracks can be either rows or columns, it's kind of both. Now, if you need to create a specific arrangement of columns and or rows, instead of having an automatic grid like we have here, you can use the properties grid template columns and grid template rows. So let's start with grid template columns. And I'm also going to delete the grid autoflow. So I want to create a grid that has 2 columns. So on the grid parent, we can add this with grid template columns. And then the value is going to be the number and size of the columns. So if I want 2 columns, I'm going to write 2 numbers here. And each number is going to be the column size. So if I write 100 pixels, 200 pixels, this is going to create a grid template that has 2 columns. The first one's going to be 100 pixels wide. Second one is going to be 200 pixels wide. So when I save, now we have a grid that has 2 columns. And because we have 4 grid child items in our HTML here, the browser is automatically going to place each grid child item into one cell of the grid template, giving us 2 rows of 2 columns each, even though we didn't explicitly designate any rows. So this is because the grid is kind of smart and it's going to make guesses about how we want the grid items to look, even if we don't have explicit rules for everything. And this is going to be the difference between the explicit grid and the implicit grid. So the explicit part of the grid template is the 2 columns that we created with grid template columns. And then the browser is going to auto-generate 2 rows in order to fit those 4 grid child items. And the 2 rows are part of the implicit grid because we have not explicitly written a style to create those rows. And we can actually see both the explicit and implicit grid in our Firefox grid inspection tools. So if I right click and inspect the grid, let's go to the layout tab, and then in the grid panel here, we can see information about the grid and display settings. And then we also have, if I select the parent and I check that box, we have a little diagram of the actual grid template showing us 2 columns and 2 rows, and there's dotted lines between each cell. Now the explicit grid is shown in solid lines on our website. The first row line here and then the first column line are always going to be solid. I'm assuming because we just created a grid in the first place, and that's just the explicit part of that. Then for the columns, because we did explicitly use grid template columns, the second column line is dashed, and then the outside of the last column is solid. However, for the rows, they are in the implicit grid, so the second row line is dotted. I don't know if you can see that. Dotted instead of dashed. And then the last row line is also dotted. So the thin dotted lines are the implicit grid that the browser kind of auto-generates based on what information we have. So let's change this by explicitly creating rows in our grid template. So in the grid parent, I'm going to say grid template rows, and I'm going to set it to 200 pixels, 100 pixels. And this is going to explicitly create 2 rows. First one is going to be 200 pixels tall. Second one's going to be 100 pixels tall. So when we save, now on our website, the second row line is now dashed instead of dotted like it was before. If I uncomment that, you can see dashed, and then now it is dotted. And then the last row line at the bottom is solid. So this is now because the rows are part of the explicit grid instead of the implicit grid like they were before. Now, in practice, I'm usually going to explicitly create columns, and I usually let the rows just auto-generate and then be sized according to the content that they have inside them. because, even if we take away the explicit rows, the grid still looks pretty good. There's nothing broken about it. So this generally works fine for me because you really just want to create the columns most of the time, and then the rows can auto-generate. Now, when you're creating a grid template, a lot of times you're not necessarily going to want specific pixel size columns like we have here, but instead you might want to use a relative unit. And Grid has a special relative unit that you can use to size the tracks, the columns or rows, called the FR or fractional unit. This fractional unit is going to divide the available space between the grid child items. For example, if I want to have two columns that are equal width, I can set grid template columns to be 1FR, 1FR. Because both numbers are the same, they're both ones, that means that the two columns in our grid template are going to be the same width. So when I save, we now have two columns and they're the same size. And you can also use different numbers for the FR units in order to set different relative widths. So if I make the second column 2FR instead of 1FR, that's going to make the second column twice the width of the first column. And when I save, you can see that the second column is bigger, first column is smaller. Also, the other benefit of using the FR unit in your grid is that it is responsive. So if I take the window and I increase the viewport width, both columns are going to grow depending on how much available width there is. And they're always going to maintain that same ratio of size to each other, where the second column is going to be double the size of the first column. Now, sometimes you might need part of your grid to be a specific static size. For example, let's say you have a sidebar that needs to be 150 pixels wide all the time. You can add 150 pixels for the first column, and then set the second column to be 1FR to take up all available remaining space. So when I save, we have the first column, 150 pixels, and the second column, whatever space is left. And if I increase the viewport width, the first column stays 150 pixels, and the second column will grow as the viewport width grows. So this is a pretty common use of static plus relative units. And one other tip, if you're creating a grid that has multiple columns that are all the same size, you can use the repeat function. It's a grid-specific function to make your column sizes a bit more efficient. So let me show you what that looks like. So let's go back to 1FR, 1FR. So let's say you don't want to write 1FR, 1FR. What you can do is write repeat, and then repeat takes two numbers. The first number is the number of columns, number of times you're going to repeat this. We'll say 2, comma, and the second number is the size of the column or the row, depending on if you're using this in grid template columns or grid template rows. And I'll say 1FR. So now this does exactly the same thing as 1FR, 1FR. And this can come in really handy if you're creating, a grid that has a whole bunch of columns. And we are going to be using the repeat function later on in this series when we're building dynamic responsive grids. Now, one of the coolest parts of CSS Grid is that you can create your grid template, and then you can place the grid child items anywhere you want inside that grid. So I'm going to go back to our HTML really quick, and I'm just going to remove all the extra text that we had for the second grid child. So they're all the same. And let's create a larger grid template. So I want to make a 4x4 grid template. So for grid template columns, I'm going to set it to 4 columns of equal width. And also let's make 4 rows. So we're going to say repeat 4, 1FR. And then let's duplicate this, and then we'll make the second one grid template rows. There we go. So now we have our template with 4 columns and 4 rows. Now let's say I want the first grid child to take up the entire first row. In Grid, one way we can do that is by designating the grid column and row lines that we want the grid child to be between. Now, the grid column lines begin on the left side with 1. So this is the first grid column line here. Here's the first grid column line. And then they increase. So this is 1, this is 2, 3, 4, and then 5 at the far right. And so I have to play with the zoom to make the last row show up. There we go. So I can see the last fifth grid line. And the numbers also can be numbered negatively. So starting from the right side, this is grid column line -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So this can come in really handy when you have a responsive grid that might have a different number of columns depending on your viewport width. So for our first grid child, I want it to start at grid column line 1, and then I want it to end at grid column line 5. So I'm going to add a nth child selector for 1, and we can designate the grid column lines with the property grid column. This is actually a shorthand property for grid column start and grid column end, but usually people are going to write it with grid column just because it's a bit simpler. So the first number in grid column is going to be the starting grid line, and I want it to be grid column line 1. So we'll write 1, and then you add a /, and then you write the ending grid column line number, and that's going to be 5. So when we save, now the first grid child is taking up the entire first row, all 4 columns, and then the other grid children are going to be auto-placed starting in the next available cell. So we have grid child 2 starting on the next row. And by default, each grid child item is going to take up 1 cell of the grid template unless you explicitly say otherwise, like we did with this first child. Now we can also write grid column using the span keyword to write how many cells we want that child item to take up or span across. So grid child 1 is taking up 1, 2, 3, 4 cells. So instead of 5 as the ending line number, we can write 1/span 4. So this is now saying it starts at 1 here, and then it spans 4 cells, 1, 2, 3, 4. So when I save, it looks exactly the same as it did before. And like I mentioned earlier, if we have a responsive grid that has different numbers of columns based on the viewport width, it would actually be more efficient to write 1/-1 in order to indicate that you want this grid child to always take up the first row, no matter how many columns there are in the template. So this is a really common practice when you want to do that. And we also can set grid row to do the same thing. So let's say we wanted the grid child 1 to also take up the first row and the second row. So what we can do is say grid row, and we want it to start at grid row line 1, and then we want it to end at grid row line 3. So now we have grid child 1 taking up 2 rows and then all of the columns. All right, so let's place the other items in the grid as well. So we have grid child 2 next, and then I want to move grid child 3 to be below grid child 2. So let's duplicate our nth child 1 selector and change this to 3. And we want to set this to start on grid row line 4. So what we can do is say grid row 4. And if we just set this, it'll be assigned to grid row start. And then by default, it's going to span just 1 cell. And we'll remove that. There we go. So by default, it's going to span 1 cell. And then also by default, it's going to be in the first grid column. Okay, and then next, let's make the grid child 4 take up the rest of these cells here. So let's duplicate this, nth child 4. And if you want, pause the video here and see what grid column and or grid row properties you need to set in order to make grid child 4 take up all of these 6 cells remaining in the grid. All right, so for this, I do want grid column because I want it to extend larger than just the default 1 cell. So we want the grid child 4 to start at grid line 2, grid column line 2, and then end at the end. So I'm going to say -1, kind of like what we did with grid child 1. There we go. And we also want it to take up 2 rows. So we'll say grid row. We want to start it at 3 and then end it at 5. Or we could say -1 for grid row. end. All right, so here's the grid with now our custom placement. And I'm also going to change the background colors of the different grid children so we can just distinguish them better from each other. So let's see, the first one's going to be background color of plum. And let's also add nth child 2. Set the background color to deep sky blue. And let's make the third one yellow. There we go. And then we'll leave the fourth child the default turquoise color that we set. There is another approach that you can use to place each of the grid child items in specific places on the grid, and that's using grid template areas. So instead of using the grid lines like we have here, we assign names to each grid child item, and then we use those names in designated parts of the grid template. I know that sounds complicated, but let me show you how this looks. So first, we want to give each grid child a name. And we can do this with the grid area property on each child selector. So we'll start with the first grid child, and I'll add grid area. And then the name is going to be item 1. It can be any name you want, a string, and I think it has to start with a letter, not a number. So item 1 is going to be the first child. So I'm going to copy that style, and we'll go to the other grid child items and add them for item 2, item 3, and item 4. And I'm also going to delete the grid column and grid row styles because we are not going to be using them anymore. And I'm not going to save the changes because this is going to kind of mess up the grid, and I want to see what the final grid should look like when we add more styles. So we have the grid area names for each child. Now we need to go to the grid parent, the grid container, and write where each of those grid children are going to be in the template. So on the parent, we'll say grid template areas. And then in here, we're going to actually recreate the columns and rows of the actual grid template using those grid area names that we just added. So we're going to start with the first row, and we have to put it in quotes. And in the first row, we have 4 columns, and each of those 4 columns in the first row are taken up by grid child 1. And grid child 1 has an area name of item 1. So what we want to do is write item 1 4 times for each of those 4 columns. So that's the first row. And we're going to do the same thing for each of the 4 rows in our template. So usually I try to put them on separate lines so you can see things a bit better. So now we'll do the same thing for the second row. The second row is also grid child 1. So we'll just do the same thing again. So now you can see we're starting to kind of build the grid template, and I accidentally saved what I didn't want to do, but that's okay. So the next one's going to be the third row, and the third row is going to be item 2, taking up 1 cell, and then item 4 was taking up the other columns. There we go. And then we're going to actually do a similar thing for the last 4th row, except item 3 is going to be in that first column. So now when we save, we have the same grid arrangement that we had before, but instead of having to set the grid column and grid row lines for each of the children, we have everything right here. So this is one reason why people like grid template areas, is because you have more of the sort of information about the grid on the grid container, the grid parent itself, instead of having to look through each of the child selectors to see where they're placed. So they both accomplish the same thing, but it is nice to have the 2 options. Now let's check out our grid inspector tools in Firefox. So on our website, by default, the grid inspector has align numbers. I'm going to uncheck the box here, and I'm going to check display area names. So now it tells us the actual grid area names of each of the children. We have item 1, then we have item 2, item 3, and then item 4. And this is really helpful so you can see exactly where everything is going. And then you can also, if you want, check the box to extend lines infinitely. This can help if you're trying to line up different sections of the website. Now, just like Flexbox, Grid has properties that you can set on either the grid parent or the grid child in order to align the grid child items within their available space on the grid template. The justify properties are going to align grid items in the inline direction, which is horizontally, and the align properties will align the child items in the block direction or vertically. And the justify items property is set on the grid parent, and it's going to horizontally align each of the child items. Now, by default, justify items is set to stretch, and this is why the grid child items are all stretching to take up all the cells that they're placed in the grid template. However, let's try some other values for this. So let's say justify items, and if we set it to start, now we are going to align them to the left or the start side of the inline direction. And this stops them from stretching, so they're now sized their width according to the content. So let's change some of the content and make the first grid child a bit longer. So I'm going to say lorem 10 words of placeholder text. So now you can see that the first grid child is now extending because it has more content. So you can also set justify items to end to align them to the right side or the end side of the inline direction. And a lot of times you're going to want to center. So justify item center will align each child in the center of where they are in the grid. Now you can also use justify self to align individual grid child items. So I can say, let's say I want the fourth grid child to be on the end side, but everything else is going to be centered. So I'll go down to the nth child 4, and I'll say justify self end. So now just the fourth child is aligned to the end side, and everything else has been left at centered. Now there's another property that you can use to align the grid horizontally. That's justify content. I don't use this as often, but you can use it if the grid template doesn't take up 100% of the width of the grid container element, meaning the gray parent div. So let me show you how that would work. So if the grid is 4 columns of, instead of 1 FR, it's 100 pixels, then the grid template, you can see here, is narrower than the grid parent div itself. So now we can use justify content to align the grid in different places. So by default, it's going to be start, which is the left side. If we set it to end, this is going to move the entire grid template, so all of the grid in the group, to the right side, the end side. Or of course, center will center it inside the gray div. You can also set space between to put all the extra space between the columns, and do space evenly to divide the space equally between and outside the grid columns. It is thrown off a little bit by the gap, so it makes the inner space a bit wider. And then you can also do justify around to make the space outside half as big as the space between the columns. But to be honest, I don't use justify content very often. Generally, you are going to be sizing your grid columns with 1 FR, and that will make the grid take up all available space, so you aren't going to need justify content very often, but sometimes you will. And we can also align the grid child items vertically within their available cells with the align properties. So on the grid parent, we can align all the grid child items with align items. I'm just going to delete what we had before with the justify properties. So we'll say align items, and by default it is set to stretch. So let's set it to start. Now they're going to stop stretching, and their height is going to be based on the content. So, and they will also be aligned to the top. So the first grid child is aligned to the top, and then each of the other ones are also aligned to the top within here. You can't tell with the grid 2 and 3 just because their cells are not as big. And if we do end, it'll vertically align them to the bottom, and center will center them vertically. And similar to justify self, we can individually align grid child items using the align self property. So let's say I want to vertically set the first grid child item to the top. I can say align self, start, and there we go. And we can also vertically align the grid as a whole inside the parent if there is extra available height. So let's go back to align items stretch, which is a default. There we go. And again, this is generally only going to happen if you set on the grid parent the row size that's going to be a static height that's smaller than the actual parent. So we can make this happen by saying each row is going to be 60 pixels tall instead of 1FR. And then we also need to set a static height on the actual div itself. So let's say height of 400 pixels. So now it's 400 pixels. And then the rows are a static 60 pixels. So by default, it's going to be aligned to the top or the start. We can also align it to the end or the bottom. And of course, center to center it within the div. And we can also do the space between to divide the space between the rows. We can do space evenly to have the space between and also around. And then space around is going to be half as much space on the outside of the rows as between them. The last thing I want to show you is that you can use the place shorthand properties to set both justify and align properties at the same time. So I'm going to zoom out a bit here. Now let's make our columns a static width of 140 pixels. Make the rows 80 pixels. And then I'm just going to delete the other align properties that we added. So here we go. So if I set place items to start, this is going to set align items to start, which will vertically align the grid child items to the top of their area. So you can see they're all aligned to the top. And it's also going to set justify items to start, which will horizontally align the grid child items to the left or the start side of the area, which you can see they're all aligned to the left there. And then if we want to set justify items to end, but leave align items to start, we can say place items start end. So the first value of place items will be set on align items. Second value is going to set justify items. So now we have horizontally, or I guess vertically with align items, they're aligned to the top or the start, and then justify items is set to the end or the right side horizontally. But usually, if you are going to see or use place items, people generally use it for center, to center the grid child items both horizontally and vertically. And you can do the same thing with place content. This will center the grid itself horizontally and vertically inside the grid parent. All right, so now we've covered the basics of both Flexbox and Grid. Next up, we're going to look at how to actually apply Flexbox and Grid styles to build responsive layouts, and we'll get into some more advanced techniques.